Hi, you are listening to the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. This podcast is for policymakers, governments, researchers, students, businesses, and anyone that is interested in conflict and development issues in Africa. On this podcast, we hear from experts from across Africa and the world. Your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa, will ask the questions you would want answers to. Michael Nwankpa has an extensive experience spanning over a decade studying, researching, writing, and consulting on conflict and development issues in Africa.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa. Today, we're going to be discussing Boko Haram's connections and international sources of funding. I'm joined by a very special guest, my very good friend, and a returning guest, James Barnett. James is a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford and also a fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. James, it's very great to see you. I look forward to a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Michael. It's a pleasure to be back.
Brilliant. The last time you joined us, we was in Nigeria. We spoke about, and we spoke about. I guess it was Somaliland and the agreement with Ethiopia, the recognition with Ethiopia, and that has remained one of our most viewed episode. So I'm hoping we'll have the same effect. We have the James effect.
That's a very high standard I've set.
Yes, indeed. So, but we're going to look at let me begin by saying, what is the scope? I know in the last couple of years, Boko Haram, there's been Boko Haram. I wouldn't say Boko Haram is at its peak. Boko Haram, is past this peak. But we've been seeing a lot of factions and a lot of attacks recently, and it's been in the news recently as well. What is the scope? Or let's start from this. What is the state? What is the status of Boko Haram right now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I guess it depends on how you define Boko Haram, right? If you use the term as being synonymous with kind of the original faction and kind of insurgent movement that we often use scholars will often use the abbreviation JAS or JASDJ for the Arabic name that it actually goes by, because of course the group never actually called itself Boko Haram. So if we're talking about that specific faction, then that's one question. If we're talking about, I think what you probably mean is the Boko Haram conflict broadly, right? Which I think is you can refer that to kind of all the violence, the jihadist violence in the northeast, although of Nigeria and the Lake Chad Basin more broadly. Although increasingly it's also there are manifestations of it in northwestern Nigeria, some of the kind of central, what they call the north central states of Nigeria. And these days it's getting even more complicated because you have also the broader instability and Salafi jihadist violence in the Sahel region. So you have some of these groups that operate in Niger and Benin also kind of increasingly encroaching on Nigeria. So I think, if we talk about kind of Boko Haram, meaning the broader conflict that really kicked off in the Northeast in 2009, I would say that the conflict it's fragmented, but it's still quite intense, though, with varying degrees of intensity in different regions, right? So you have two main factions in the Northeast. You have the JAS and then ISWAP, the Islamic State West Africa province. ISWAP is often, still referred to in kind of literature or media reporting as kind of a faction or a splinter of Boko Haram, which in some ways is true, but it's been the larger and more dominant and I think kind of better organized faction for some years now. Although there, and JAS is kind of, to some extent, there are really several kind of factions or cells of JAS operating in the Northeast that in somewhat kind of autonomous manner. But that factionalism is one kind of important element of the question, and that factionalism can actually be quite violent and intense, right? Throughout kind of from I think roughly late 2022 throughout 2023, there was actually quite a lot of fighting in the Northeast between ISWAP and JAS, particularly the JAS group that is operating around the Lake Chad region, kind of in those islands there. So that was kind of giving a bit of, to some extent, a bit of respite to, I think, the security forces and local civilians, because the jihadists were kind of fighting themselves more than they were concentrating on fighting local militaries. But that's while that conflict and stuff is still there, what we've seen is that both of these groups, both the JAS led by Bakura Doro in the Northeast, but also ISWAP, that they're still very capable, not only of attacks against security forces, which in the case of ISWAP, I think they are kind of doing smaller scale attacks than they did maybe 5 or 6 years ago. There's kind of a bit of a what you might call a strategic stalemate insofar as that ISWAP can no longer do the big massed attacks against the Nigerian military that it used to, but they're also not defeated. But we've seen, from the Bakura faction, also some very deadly attacks. Most recently, or I think a couple months ago now in Chad, where they killed several dozen Chadian soldiers. So both of these groups are still militarily quite capable, and they're still, waging or inflicting a lot of violence against civilians in the Northeast. Here there is kind of a broad difference in strategy and ideology, I'd say, between JAS and ISWAP in terms of the kind of permissibility or the conditions under which they would kill Muslim civilians. Both groups attack, the regional militaries. They attack any institutions or individuals kind of affiliated with the state. But ISWAP, partially, as a result of this kind of the split with Abu Bakr Shekau some years ago, they typically are less, how should I say, they try to be a bit more discriminate in terms of not just kind of killing anyone who is not an active member of the group in the way that Shekau did. They're trying to do a bit more of a hearts and minds approach, targeting again only kind of these rural Muslim civilians in the Northeast who are not actively cooperating with the military. So that's kind of created, I think, the paradigm that a lot of analysts and scholars of Boko Haram and this conflict in the last few years have kind of been in this mindset of, okay, JAS is kind of the more predatory, indiscriminate group that doesn't have as much of maybe a strategy for growth or expansion, whereas ISWAP is actually in some ways more of the dangerous group because they're trying more of a hearts and mind insurgency. They're the ones that have the strong international links and very much a franchise of the Islamic State. But I think that, the reality is, in fact, a bit more complex and nuanced. What we're seeing is, JAS is also under the Bakura faction. They've been experimenting with, what you could call kind of proto-rebel governance, jihadist governance, and kind of to an extent that the group didn't really do under Shekau. And we're also seeing that ISWAP, it's important to remember, they're not exactly kind of the softer side of jihad, which is, I think, a somewhat tongue-in-cheek or ironic phrase or term that some analysts or scholars have used, because they're also, as we saw with this very horrific massacre, I believe it was last August, they're also engaged in indiscriminate or pretty severe violence against civilians when they think it fits their strategic objectives. So that's kind of the broader balance in the Northeast. The political situation, specifically between Nigeria and Niger, has also been, I think, a complicating or compounding factor since the coup in July 2023 and the subsequent kind of real deterioration of relations. There's been, there were some positive signs kind of later last year, I think over the summer, kind of signs of normalization and a resumption of cooperation between the Nigerian and Nigerian militaries under the auspices of the MNJTF. But recently there's been real kind of, the Nigerian junta has kind of, I think, tried to scapegoat some of the violence that they're experiencing, some of the insecurity, kind of putting that blame on Nigeria. So the relationship is still not, it's still not what it was before the coup, and that has real impacts on the situation in the Northeast.
You've mentioned so many things, but let me start from one thing. So from 2009, the Boko Haram we knew then had clear agendas or stated agendas, which is, Sharia, turn Nigeria into a Sharia state. But what do they want now? Both Boko Haram and ISWAP.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ultimate objective is the same insofar as they want to establish, um, it's not just like, they don't want a Sharia state in the same way that like, um, you know, uh, Governor Sani Arima in Zamfara in 1999 introduced Sharia and made it a Sharia state, and then the 11 other northern states followed. What they want is to, kind of it's the same goal that, say, the global Salafi jihadist movement have, that both, the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, they have different strategies, somewhat different ideologies, but they ultimately want the same thing, which is the erasure of kind of the entire current international system, the Westphalian system of nation states. And they want a transnational, kind of caliphate, essentially resurrected, that is based on their very specific, hardline, kind of interpretation of Sharia law. I think, broadly, I'd categorize, both JAS and ISWAP as Salafi jihadist movements, to indicate that they are kind of an outgrowth or a splintering, if you will, of kind of a broader Salafist worldview in terms of this very doctrinaire, you could call it maybe puritanical sense of kind of what an Islamic state and society should look like. But they differ, of course, from the millions of other Salafis around the world who are nonviolent, insofar as that they want to wage a violent offensive jihad to achieve that. So I think that ultimately those objectives, if you're talking ideologically, I think that's still the objective. On a day-to-day kind of level, on the level of kind of their operations, or even their strategic level, of course, they're nowhere near doing anything like this, right? And the violence in Nigeria, and the jihadist violence kind of specifically, it's in a position where I'd say the core insurgency is largely contained to the Northeast, and to the kind of the rural sectors of the Northeast, particularly in Borno states, parts of Yobe and Adamawa, and then parts of neighboring Cameroon, Niger, and Chad. Um, but the jihadists are not. This isn't like Afghanistan in July 2021. It's not like Somalia today, or even Mali today, right? I think that the jihadist violence is in many ways more contained, and the state as a whole is not in as weak a position. So there's no real risk that like they're going to be raising black flags over Abuja and then kind of taking over the country in the way that the Taliban did. So that idea of creating like a Salafi jihadist proto-caliphal state is incredibly distant. It's not going it's not going to happen. Um, but at the same time, they're also fighting for their survival. They're continuing their insurgency because they believe in the cause, and other various factors, I think. But to a large extent, I think the leadership of these groups does ultimately believe in this, and I think they do believe that they will eventually prevail and stuff. But they're, I think, in the Northeast, they're trying to show that they're still strong, that they're still relevant. They're trying to control the local population, and like I said, some of the stuff needed for survival and to wage an insurgency. They're trying to control logistics corridors so they can get supplies, weapons, ammunition. They're trying to exert their influence over local civilians, so that both they have that cooperation, but also source of resources, taxation, and stuff. They're trying to to a large extent in the Northeast, I think they're trying to outgun or outmaneuver each other to kind of re-jeopardize, or sorry, re-monopolize the jihad under kind of one banner, in the way it was from, say, 2009 to 2015, 2016, before the ISWAP JAS kind of fissure. But then it does, all that said, it gets a bit complicated, because a lot of my research is actually not in the northeast of Nigeria, though I've been there, and I'm planning to go back soon. And
yeah, I was going to come there. Yeah, go on. Yeah.
Yes, right. So as you know, right, I do a lot of work in the Northwest and then the North Central states, and that's an area that I've been looking at for several years.
Let me ask you to hold on let me ask you to hold on a bit on the Northwest, because I'm going to come there. But I wanted to quickly answer this before. Since we're talking on the Northeast, we'll go to the Northwest in a minute. So earlier on, you were talking about the distinction, between ISWAP and or the not too distinctive in their tactics, in terms of like attack on civilians, or the ability to be able to use harsh measures on the civilian for that strategic objective. You also talked about the not so distinctive nature of the attempt at governance. I particularly use the Bakura faction, how it's kind of like modeling ISWAP, kind of administrative, heart and mind kind of like approach. But so I guess the question is, when we often in the literature, when they talk about, they usually want to compare ISWAP with jazz using the local global dichotomy kind of thing, trying to say Boko Haram is more locally, his influence is more locally, why ISWAP is. Does that relate to the struggle, the fraction between this group, the struggle between this group? Does that have any impact in their struggle, in their fight?
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty complex matter, and I feel like the local global dichotomy sometimes, using that paradigm can maybe cause more confusion than it can be helpful, because these two, they don't have to be, and they never were mutually exclusive, right? So I think that nowadays what we're talking about is, like, in terms of direct ties, affiliation, kind of franchising, right? And in that case, yes, it's clear, ISWAP is a franchise, not just a franchise, like an important affiliate, an important province of the Islamic State's broader global efforts and stuff. Now, it's a highly autonomous one. It is one rooted in the local context. The entire Boko Haram conflict, is rooted in the local, of course, Nigerian political and social context. But also inspired by kind of global Salafi jihadist thought, first in Al Qaeda and stuff, and then, more recently in terms of the Islamic State. In terms of the kind of day-to-day operations of these groups and stuff, because ISWAP is that, is part of that global Islamic State network, I think it lends the group probably to some extent more kind of, some resources and advantages that maybe the Bakura faction wouldn't have, because the Bakura faction, as far as we know, doesn't have any, the same degree of kind of international connection, or you can call it even sponsorship. But I think the flip side of that is that also these days, kind of the dichotomy has actually shifted a bit from what it was maybe 10 years ago. ISWAP is actually probably doing more for kind of the Islamic State model or franchise globally than the Islamic State is giving in return. If that makes sense. And just to kind of illustrate this. So, at the time, right, Boko Haram, from say 2009 to 2015, it was not a formal affiliate of any kind of global jihadist group. There was some interest, and even if you go into the early history, there are kind of different factions where some members of the group wanted to be more internationally aligned. Some of them actually, I think, did split and have kind of formed a group called Ansaru that was a bit more connected to the global Al Qaeda network, or at least through Algeria and stuff. But the Boko Haram, under the leadership of first Mohammed Yusuf and then Abu Bakr Shakau, never pledged what's called bay'ah, right? This kind of oath of loyalty that you pledge to an individual, not a group. But in the case of Al Qaeda, they would have pledged it to Bin Laden, and then after that, Zawahiri. In the case of Islamic State, they pledged it to Baghdadi, or whoever the current caliph is. They killed like 4 of them. So, but that I think that question, or that idea of the bay'ah, is very important. And so it's, Boko Haram never did that. They never kind of put themselves fully into a global jihadist camp. Now, obviously, that started to change in 2015, 2016. That's when you had this split between JAS and ISWAP. And part of the reason for that split, as I've kind of written about in the past, in some of my past writing, and I've interviewed a few people who were kind of senior commanders, defectors, who were at the time senior commanders in that group, essentially, and there was already internal dissent within the Boko Haram movement. There was some skepticism of Abu Bakr Shakau's tactics. Some people thought they were very extreme, particularly some of this stuff about, targeting Muslims and stuff like suicide bombings, using women and children as suicide bombers, attacking mosques. Again, Shakau had this ultra exclusivist kind of view that essentially any Muslim who does not willingly come and join us in our camps and fight with us is essentially, he's a disbeliever. So you had that internal kind of disagreement and dissent, and then at the same time, Boko Haram was trying to kind of they were testing the waters with the Islamic State, or maybe it's better to say the Islamic State was testing the waters with Boko Haram. They and you know, some other scholars like Vincent Foucher and others have done really kind of good detailed work on this. That we know that the Islamic State sent money, they sent some trainers. First, they were talking, you know, through remote communications, and eventually they sent people. And that, you know, it was kind of that contact with those external jihadis that allowed, that kind of cemented that split essentially within Boko Haram. Because as one of the guys that I interviewed, he's a, you know, was a senior jihadist defector. This was some years ago for a research project in Nigeria. You know, he talked about it as, well, we'd all, you know, a lot of us had kind of already started to have doubts about Shekau, especially because at that point, the Nigerian military, the regional militaries were responding. So Boko Haram was losing ground. And, but, you know, it was getting that kind of the external authority that, you know, the Islamic State, right, the Caliph himself, Abu Bakr Baghdadi, they take that, you know, very seriously. They see him as the leader of Muslims. So they say, when he was also telling us, when the Islamic State was telling us that Shekau's tactics were wrong, that was kind of what influenced you know, this fissure. And so essentially, and the Islamic State ended up lending support to the one group over the other, to ISWAP over Shekau's faction. So at that time, in that early kind of period, and maybe for the first few years, the Islamic State was really sending, you know, kind of money, I think to some extent material, but mostly money and skills, you know, in terms of trainers and stuff. So they were helping the Islamic State improve their tactics. They had Arabs coming in through Libya, but also stuff like remote training. They had a kind of sophisticated network that even ran through Dubai and Abu Dhabi of money laundering, how they get the money into Nigeria. And then they were also very important on kind of broader theological and strategic matters. They gave advice to to ISWAP about, you know, strategy, tactics, but also kind of stuff like, how do you govern an Islamic State, right? In the territory you have, how do you, you know, here are some of the elements that ISIS used in Raqqa and Mosul, and here's how you could use them in Nigeria. Now, if we fast forward to today, to 2025, to get somewhat, you know, belatedly to your question, you know, the dynamic has shifted a lot, right? All of this, what I was describing, was at a time when you still had like the ISIS caliphate in Iraq and Syria, and now that was destroyed, right, in Baghouz in March 2019. So the Islamic State, they're still in Iraq and Syria. The leadership is mostly seems to be in Syria, or maybe, you know, some people say Turkey, but that group in the you know, the so-called core provinces in the Middle East is weaker. But at the same time, Islamic State affiliates in Africa, not just ISWAP, but in other regions, have had, you know, a decent bit of growth and success over the past few years. And ISWAP has been one of the big ones in terms of, you know, not only its military success, which I think there's been less of in recent years, but in 2018, 2019, 2020, they were, you know, they were scoring some big wins in terms of overrunning military bases in the Northeast and stuff. But also kind of in terms of their governance, their propaganda, they can show, look, we're administering an Islamic State. So ISWAP started to become kind of very valuable to the broader Islamic State kind of franchise, if you will, to the broader Islamic State network. And we know that the Islamic State has these regional offices. There are two in Africa. There's the Al-Qarar office in East Africa and the Al-Furqan office in West Africa. And that essentially that West African office is kind of used to coordinate affairs and strategy and share best practices and stuff, and you know, essentially kind of, you know, coordinate jihadist strategy between ISWAP and the Lake Chad Basin area, and then the Islamic State Sahel province, which is, you know, mostly operating in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. So at the moment, we don't hear as much about, you know, oh, okay, trainers going to ISWAP to train them in tactics. Although actually, just recently, ISWAP did release photos showing two foreign fighters. I think they said like a Palestinian and a Moroccan that were there. So it is still happening. But I think that by and large, like ISWAP's model, like ISWAP, it kind of has a model that it's been using for several years in terms of, you know, and it adapts to the local circumstances, right? They used to mass their forces and use, you know, armored trucks and pickups, Hilux that they, you know, looted from previous military attacks. They used to mass these big groups and then try to overrun these forward operating bases. They were doing that for a few years, but they can't really do that so easily anymore because the Nigerian military, the army, and the air force have improved coordination. It's harder for them to do that, so they've kind of shifted their tactics in line with the local dynamics of the conflict. So they're kind of they have a model that's, you know, sustaining their insurgency to a large extent. So I don't think they necessarily need that kind of day-to-day management or guidance or advice. I wouldn't say it was ever management, but that guidance and advice at the more tactical and operational level, I don't think that's actually as important for them as it used to be. But the one area where apparently ISWAP does, I think, still take real serious guidance is on kind of the broader strategy and specifically on theological matters. And so, you hear this from defectors, you see it in stuff like the United Nations, reports on Islamic State and Al Qaeda, that, the periods where you hear of kind of, foreigners like emissaries or envoys from the Islamic State coming from the Middle East, usually from Libya or through Libya down to Lake Chad, is often when there's kind of internal disagreement in ISWAP about kind of what strategy to pursue, essentially, or about a kind of ideological question and stuff. And so there, I think, again, it's important to remember the ideological or theological dimension of this, which is that ISWAP still sees, the Islamic State as the legitimate, valid, caliphate. Even though it lost its core territories in Iraq and Syria, it's in the process of rebuilding, is how they see it. And so to them, they really, on that kind of broader guidance and vision and stuff, they still defer to that, to those external authorities as real authorities, I think, that should guide their actions. But on the day-to-day level, I don't think they're not getting orders for, okay, attack this outpost or that outpost from the Middle East. But like I said, very recently there was evidence, or not evidence, ISWAP published the fact that they have some Arab trainers in their camps. So it's, yeah, I mean, it's maybe,
I agree with you mostly. I agree with you mostly, and it kind of mirrors my research as well. When you talk about first of all, Boko Haram, let's say Boko Haram under Shekau, when ISWAP was ISIS was caught in Boko Haram, because the way I've said it is a kind of like a mutual, because sometimes people look at it as like a one-way stream. Now, ISIS was also caught in Boko Haram. Boko Haram presented itself, as presented itself as a credible, provided that route or into the largest Muslim population in Africa, which would be northern Nigeria. So, and also in my own estimation, Boko Haram was at a decline at the time and needed ISIS whatever to also boost his whatever. So it was more like a mutual kind of stuff. But in terms of the local, since we've gotten to the connection, the local whatever dynamic, you mentioned Ansaru. And I think in my perspective, I think Boko Haram has always struggled with defining, or Boko Haram has always wrestled, even before this external stuff, with the local, whether it's the local or whether it's going to be moved by external, the transnational jihadist narrative or jihadist discourse. And as early as 2011-12 was when I had the Ansaru. But now this comes to your research now. So when Ansaru splitted from Boko Haram, Ansaru operated in the northwest. It was mainly based in the northwest, north central, not the Boko Haram core north. But we still see that kind of like dynamic still going on now, with either is a Boko Haram faction. Before Shekau tried to take credit for the prison, or was it the kidnap or the prison, the kidnap of the boys that was carried out by the bandits or the militia team.
Yeah, Conqueror abduction.
Yeah, and then we've also seen in your work as well, which I've read, we've also seen attempts Boko Haram trying to have a strong foothold in Northwest. So there's always been that kind of like division. So I want to talk about what is Boko Haram's status in the Northwest. And it seems the Northwest seems to be the corridor, like you rightly mentioned, for groups in the Sahel or the wider jihadist group in the Sahel coming into Nigeria. So is Boko Haram still a player, or is it ISIS? Because is ISIS just focused on the Lake Chad area, or is ISWAP? I mean, ISWAP is ISWAP also trying to connect with these groups in the north? What is this complex maze? Can you explain this complex maze in the Northwest?
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Michael. It's so the situation's, always evolving, right? And I'm even kind of at the moment working on new research, trying to kind of make sense of this and stuff. So it's good to maybe like have a check-in every 6 months to give a, updated assessment. But by and large, you mentioned some of the stuff I've written earlier on this. My argument, and what I still see today in the current dynamics, is that expansion by jihadist groups, and specifically the Nigerian jihadist groups, it's maybe a bit different if we talk about, say, JNIM and IS Sahel province, who are kind of newer, to some extent, newer entrants into the space. But we could talk about that after. But the Nigerian jihadists in particular have actually had more trouble expanding into the Northwest. They've faced a lot of challenges there that I think a lot of analysis of, jihadist insurgency and a lot of analysis of conflict in the Northwest has kind of typically has maybe missed those nuances. So, the context here is that Northwestern Nigeria has been suffering from its own really acute levels of violence for depending on how you define it, certainly the past 5 years have been some of the most violent. And then, but even throughout the 2010s, really from the early 2010s, you had growing levels of intercommunal conflict and rural banditry, and the two have really kind of meshed to the point that they're essentially, I think, one kind of broader conflict. So you have dozens of these different kind of warlords, these bandit gangs led by these kingpins. I call them warlords because I think that's a more accurate reflection of kind of their dynamics, the fact that they actually, in many instances, control territory. They exert real influence over the rural population. So this conflict and this violence has been going on for a long time in the Northwest now. Boko Haram, or jihadists in Nigeria have attempted to expand into the Northwest from their kind of core base in the Northeast, right? And it's very important to remember the Boko Haram conflict really, it is, rooted in a lot of the local dynamics and stuff in the Northeast. Early on, the group had, they got supporters, they had fighters from all different parts of Nigeria and stuff, but the insurgency in 2009, it started in Maiduguri. Even if you want to take an earlier start date and refer to this incident called the so-called
Yobe.
Nigerian Taliban, and this commune in Kanama, that was just neighboring in Yobe State. So the Northeast has always been, in many ways, like the center of gravity of the insurgency, right? And to this day, most of the fighters, in this insurgency, they hail from the Northeast, right? They're recruited locally, all that stuff. In the early kind of, I'd say, from say 2010 to 2014, 2015, Boko Haram was able to pull off, and this was again under Shekau's leadership. They were able to pull off a lot of terrorist attacks across the north more broadly, but mostly in urban areas. So it wasn't kind of, they weren't using the issue of banditry as a vector so much. They had more of these kind of urban cells, Ansaru as well, right, in places like Kano, Zaria, Kaduna, in those areas. By 2015, the Nigerian security forces had kind of, gotten their act together a bit more. They'd identified a lot of these cells, rolled them up. Like I said, and as you alluded to, they were applying pressure on Boko Haram in the Northeast. So the group kind of constricted, and so it wasn't able to do as much. And to date, we've not had kind of, thankfully, a repeat of the kind of high levels of attacks and stuff that you had in the early 2010s. But what we've seen then is that since the mid 2010s onwards, various jihadists, JAS, but then also ISWAP, and then also this Ansaru faction that kind of was essentially defunct or dormant by 2015 or so, 2016. A lot of its leaders were arrested or killed, kind of went underground, but then it reemerged around 2020, 2021, and it reemerged in the Northwest. So if you look at it as three main groups, JAS, Ansaru, and ISWAP, though in reality, as I'm finding, I think it's actually more complex than that. You have different networks, different commanders and stuff. You have the foreign groups, but let's just start with those three groups. They've been trying to come in. They've made attempts repeatedly over the past 10 years to try to kind of expand into the Northwest by essentially exploiting the kind of prevalence of those bandits and the criminal violence, and also exploiting the intercommunal violence. Through, for example, adopting a kind of model in the case of, say, Ansaru, adopting a model that JNIM had, adopted with pretty, serious success in places like Burkina Faso and Mali, which is to insert itself into an intercommunal conflict, kind of defend one community against the other, and then that community is kind of indebted to, and pushed into the arms of the jihadists. And by and large, that strategy, it's not had as much success, I think, as the jihadists had initially anticipated, in part because the banditry is so complex in its own right, and the bandits themselves are very powerful, very deadly, but in many ways very parochial figures. And so it's been very hard for jihadists to kind of recruit bandits en masse. And so we see, and I think, to a large extent, that still remains the case. Now, the caveat here, or the counterpoint to this, is that there are jihadists in the Northwest. They are, and not only are they in the Northwest, they are a problem in the Northwest. They have pulled off some really, serious attacks, right? The Abuja Kaduna train kidnapping was conducted by this JAS Boko Haram kind of network led by one commander known as Sadiku. The Kuje prison break just outside of Abuja, was conducted by ISWAP, but I think with collaboration from other jihadists utilizing transit corridors and stuff through the Northwest. Now you have the presence of, I think Islamic State Sahel province, or you've had it intermittently for several years through these guys called La Kurawa in the Northwest. You have more stuff happening in Niger State that still, I think, researchers were trying to get a better sense of what the dynamics are, who the figures are. But all to say that, this is a problem, but it's also very different from the Northeast. The jihadists have not monopolized violence, even among non-state actors in the Northwest, in a way that in the Northeast, the main problem there is jihadism. Yes, you have banditry, you have, all certainly other types of security issues, but the main problem there is jihadism. The jihadists control the most territory, if excluding the government, right? If we're talking about in the space of non-state actors, the jihadists control the most territory, they have the most weapons, whether it's ISWAP, the Bakura faction, Aliyu and Golde's faction, and the Mandara Mountains, that's really the main issue in the Northeast. In the Northwest, my argument is that the banditry remains the main problem, and that the jihadists, they face, and it's different for each group, right? JAS, ISWAP, Ansaru, some groups have more success than others, but all of them face the same kind of opportunities, but also constraints. And I think this is actually demonstrated by, just a recent incident where it appears, still trying to verify some details, but it appears that a very powerful bandit named Dogo Gide, who has a history of fighting of collaborating with jihadist groups, that his gang has actually been fighting with some JAS fighters of this network called Sadiku, which, if this is confirmed, that would be interesting, because Sadiku's group had actually probably been, in some ways, the most successful of jihadists in the Northwest in terms of trying to cement, kind of maintain ties with the bandits. There was a kind of very pragmatic political approach he took to all of this. But I think that there are limits to how much, these jihadists can align with the bandits, in part because, the bandits themselves, I'm using that term generally, but there's no bandit insurgency, right? There are dozens of different gangs. Sometimes they cooperate, but they also compete with each other. You have the egos of individual warlords and stuff. So, all to say that it's actually the Northwest is such a complex conflict environment to begin with. This issue of banditry, the intercommunal conflict, all of that is very complex. And much as that, has been a challenge for the Nigerian government and others in trying to address it, it's also to some extent been a challenge for some of these jihadists who are trying to expand into there. With, again, my final concluding point here will be that none of this is a excuse to be complacent, because, as I mentioned, right, there have already been big attacks by jihadists in the region, and the longer that they're there, the more that time that the jihadists have to learn how things work in the Northwest, to learn the personalities, what strategies work and what don't. That's just a recipe for trouble. But it's also important, I think, not to be maybe alarmist, and to recognize that the current kind of drivers of violence in the Northwest are still principally, I think, rooted in these more local issues, banditry, farmer herder violence, and stuff. And so, if you want to have solutions, you need to look at those local dynamics.
Exactly. Let me start from that. We might be able to have two more questions, but let me start with the first. Since you mentioned, you ended with that. So, what it seems to me, you mentioned, which I've also seen in my research, but before I start, I want to say this in my own opinion as well. On opinion, I think the analysis, I would say post 2015, what I've seen is less ideology, more competition. So there's the mercentilist kind of approach, even among these jihadis, criminal network. Everybody's kind of vying to have the monopoly, which is what Volis said. Demari said that even when we strip aside ideology, at the end of the day, if you look at the root, look at Danfodi's jihad. It was more about who controls, who has hegemony. So that is my opinion, but that's not the question I was going to ask. I was going to ask you, like you rightly mentioned, the jihadis in the north are exploiting pre-existing intercommunal clashes that have been there for long. And you did mention the Nigerian military, one, they've capitalized on the internecine warfare between all of the jihadis to gain. But you've also mentioned one critical thing to give them credit, that they've improved in terms of their cooperation, the Navy, the days. But they've also, it does also seem that they've also not learned. I wanted to talk about one, there's been some air accidents where civilians have been, maybe accidentally bombed in
the
the
Northwest,
northwest
especially
and all of
recently.
that. And we've also seen also less from the government, broader government perspective, less attempt to deal with that root cause that is giving the incentive for all of this, that these jihadis and all that criminal groups are exploiting. So how do you explain the military's approach and also the government, wider government approach? Then I might come to the last question about the international funding.
Sure. I think I want to start by saying I don't I know you didn't ask it as a question, but I'm still going to take the liberty to treat it as one. I don't fully agree that there's no more ideology, among the jihadist groups. I think if you look at the differences, both between, say, JAS and
No,
ISWAP,
so,
or
sorry
like,
to I want to say I'm not saying there's no ideology. Even look at JNIM. I think with JNIM there was a point where they had to be reminded of their primary. It was ideology. So I'm just going by. I'm not saying it's not there, but I'm just saying it's taking a back foot
sure.
in terms of
Yeah, no,
ideology.
I think that what you see, and there's a lot to be written about this, and I'm hoping to, is that there's the different commanders. I think, especially when you start looking at the expansion of jihadis into the Northwest, different kind of commanders or networks or whatever take somewhat different approaches in terms of how pragmatic they'll be, how much they compromise on core ideological principles, and I think that can have it can have sometimes strategic or operational benefits, but it can also engender discord among the jihadis because these are still very ideological, at the level of leadership, at least, ideological figures. So that's a very interesting, maybe, some point down the line, once I've done more research, we can have another conversation about that. In terms of the military strategy, I mean, I think right, like what you're essentially describing, and you mentioned those recent airstrikes, which have been mostly I think, in the Northwest and the North Central region. Part of the problem is, I mean, just if you look at a map of Nigeria today, right, there's insecurity in every region. The military is overstretched, the security forces are overstretched. In many instances, the conflicts that you have today, the catalyst for those conflicts, in to some extent or another, was repression from the security forces, right? So you sometimes get this dynamic wherein the security forces will kind of attack these radical or heterodox dissident movements when they're kind of weak and not necessarily even fully violent yet, because they're kind of easier targets. And the politicians, the governors and stuff say, go and smash these people, and then that ends up making the problem bigger to the point that these groups militarize, it becomes a broader conflict, and then that's actually more than the security forces can handle, especially when you have all these conflicts in different areas. I think I think we both agree, right, that the mid 2010s was kind of a turning point insofar as Boko Haram reached its territorial zenith. Then the militaries, the MNJTF broadly, the Chadian and Nigerian militaries, played an important role, but also the Nigerian military, captured a lot of these areas. Then, like I mentioned, I think just in the past 5 years or so alone, there have also been kind of tactical and operational improvements that I think you do see have actually changed the battlefield picture. But the insurgency is not defeated, right? Insurgencies are very difficult to defeat, especially when they're rural. Borno State's the second largest state in Nigeria, after Niger State, which is why one reason, among others, is very concerning that you now have these different jihadists going to Niger State, because that is a massive area and it's very hard to monitor, to police, to all that stuff. So the what I'd say is there's kind of a stalemate to an extent in the Northeast, And that it can fluctuate, one way or another. It's again not a reason for complacency, but the situation, the violence, in the group is, I think, more contained territorially and operationally in that regard than it was, say, 10 years ago. But the part of the problem is that the Northwest has now gotten so violent over the past 5 years. As things were maybe, the violence was reducing to some extent in the Northeast, the situation in the Northwest was escalating and getting worse. And so the government is kind of being very reactive and essentially using the same tools that they were using in the Northeast to try to tamp down on this situation in the Northwest. And this really actually kind of, I think, escalated under Buhari, who, some of the first big military operations against bandits were launched under his tenure. And it was this idea, I think, partially, especially at that stage, it was partially rooted in, I think, maybe not fully understanding what the issue was or who the actors were and stuff, and also, how, to some extent, how enmeshed banditry is in the local dynamics, social dynamics, economic dynamics, but also political dynamics. And I think that, the problem is, if you're going to take the what you were doing in the Northeast and take those tools and apply them to the Northwest without really changing the overall strategy and stuff, well, for starters, there are going to be kind of problems inherent in that, including collateral damage, because as we've seen, there was a real issue, especially, I think, in the kind of from the mid 2010s, onwards or so, or from the, maybe say, roughly 2013 to say 2020, I think, is when you had most of those errant airstrikes in the Northeast, most famously the Ron one, but just a lot of kind of collateral damage and stuff, right? So you're using the same tools and stuff, and applying them to the Northwest, where the conflict is even more fluid. The actors are often harder to identify and stuff. So you're going to have, the more you militarize that conflict, there's going to be collateral damage like that, and we've seen that. And that collateral damage is not only tragic and horrible in its own right, but it's also, it's strategically, it's a challenge. It's politically, it's a challenge, right? Because it reduces the trust, between local communities and the security forces. It can also be politicized, and I think we're seeing that. We've seen that in the past year or so. So partially, it's that military tools inherently and military responses, especially in the way that they're applied in Nigeria, are going to, they're not going to be able. Not only can they not address everything on their own, but they're going to have their own kind of blowback and collateral. But it's also just that I think the problem in the Northwest is fundamentally different than the one in the Northeast, and unfortunately, in some ways, it's more complicated. Sometimes you talk to Nigerian government officials or analysts, and they'll say, actually, the bandits should be easier to fight because they're not ideological, right? They're just in it for money. So you just need to tweak, kind of change the incentive structure so that, you just whack them a few more times with bombs, and then they'll realize, oh, actually, cattle rustling is risky. I'll stop. If only it were that simple, right? There's a lot, like I mentioned, this is rooted in these kind of deeper issues and these communal tensions, because the conflict is so fragmented, and because the bandits have achieved in the rural communities, they've achieved, not I guess you could say they've collectively achieved a significant degree of kind of political and social influence, right? They are the authorities in
The
many
law
of these
there.
rural, hard to reach communities. They don't govern collectively, right? There's no bandit, organization. There's no Sharia council of the bandits like there is with ISWAP. But if you look at, in aggregate, even though their authority is often contested and overlapping and stuff, they still have a lot of territory. So that in and of itself makes it a very tricky problem. And it means that, as a military, or the security forces, if you're doing the kinetic approach, you have to be very careful, because, taking out one leader can actually end up complicating things, because his gang could fragment, other leaders could emerge, you could have violence against civilians. I think, the conflict it's very different, and I think its root causes, and even in many ways in the current drivers. But some parallels to this would be the drug wars in Latin America, and specifically Mexico, where I think all the empirical evidence is pretty clear that kind of the heavily kinetic leadership decapitation approach in isolation on its own doesn't actually necessarily reduce the violence. And if anything, it can actually create more blowback and increase the violence. So I think that's one of the major challenges now. And I think the current government, the NSA, they're looking at non-kinetic solutions alongside. Even just in Kaduna State, I think it was about a week ago, there was this big process of, amnesty for the bandits, they're laying down their arms. It's,
Hmm.
there have also been the non-kinetic approaches in the past, but at the state level rather than the federal level. There's not been a presidential amnesty like there was in the Niger Delta.
Yeah.
And so what we've seen also is that those non-kinetic approaches, the amnesties at the state level, because they're not coordinated with the federal government, or they're not coordinated with neighboring states, there's a lot of political dynamics to it. They don't end up, you know, they've not really worked so well in the past. The warlords themselves know how to play the system and game it.
Yeah.
So, I don't want to be one of those foreign experts just criticizing, say, oh, it's so obvious,
Nah,
it's
let me be
not
one of
obvious,
them.
right?
Let
But
me let me be one of them and say I just say that in itself is a wrong approach, because amnesty for bandits. Uh, I think if we look at the Niger Delta one, I don't think that is the way to go. I think in the northwest. Before I come to the last question, I think what I've seen or what I can analyze it from my analysis is there seems to be a redistribution of wealth. There seems to be um, an attempt not to deal with the root cause, and to just like what happened in the Niger Delta, rather than deal with the root cause, the environmental damages. It's okay, we just get Ansari, Dokubo, and all of these guys, just the warlords, just basically just give them money and
yeah,
then everything is done. I think that's what's going
co-optation.
to go, and quotation into. So I think that's what's going, and I think that until the Nigerian state deals with the root causes, these problems are. But let me come to that question because we don't have time. I wanted to use 5 minutes to talk. You did mention with ISWAP, you did mention early on when ISIS had influence, they send trainers, they send money, they send all of this. But you also mentioned that in recent times, ISWAP seems to be more influential or more to ISIS. ISIS is in a bit of a decline since since I would say since 2015 when al-Baghdadi was killed. Since then till now, ISIS Central has been in decline. But now we've seen the Nigerian army chief recently made, short of saying, he mentioned that some, I don't know if it's ISWAP now or Boko Haram members that were being caught, were caught with some foreign currency. So just implying that there's some foreign source of fund. This has always been a narrative that's been along
Yeah.
with Boko Haram. So what is this, just the normal trope that the Nigerian militaries? It's just the normal trope, or is there validity in that statement?
I mean, is there validity? Sure, there is, there's foreign support insofar as there are individuals and networks that are based in different, outside of Nigeria that are part of this, right? I mentioned earlier that, when the Islamic State, when ISIS was sending money to ISWAP in that early period, they were using this network facilitators in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. The Nigerian, was it financial sanctions or the counterterrorism task force has actually, they've sanctioned a lot of those individuals. Their names are public, the companies are public, so you can even, see a lot of that information. So yes, I mean, of course, there's international dimensions to all of this. When when the military chief or when others come out and talk about foreign sponsorship, and often in kind of a vague way, I think it's meant to imply, some sort of organized, a foreign government or organizations or stuff. Um, Very often that's the case, and it's true that you've had this since the very beginning of the crisis, because the conflict gets caught up in political narratives, historical suspicions, and mistrust and stuff, right? So for a long time there was real concern or suspicion that Chad was involved in supporting Boko Haram as a result of bad relations between the Chadian president and the Nigerian president. You'll talk
Cameroon
to
as well.
retired military people who still very strongly believe that, and they claim because that if the Chadian military was not responsive to a distress call in a border area, they'll attribute that to kind of malintent rather than say incompetence or something like that. So for a long time, people have accused Chad. Previously, France has often been a scapegoat. I think owing in large part to just the broader mistrust of France in West Africa and French neocolonial interventions, of which there is a long track record that's quite clear and stuff. Obviously, I don't buy any of those narratives. I don't think there's evidence for them. I think that many of them, if you actually look at the people that are being implicated or the countries that are being implicated in it, it's not really, it's not in their interests to support a group like Boko Haram. You also get, sometimes allegations against international NGOs, right? Because this is another space that's quite kind of contested. politically and stuff. And I think, some NGOs have in the past kind of, I think, made mistakes in their kind of strategic communications or whatever, and kind of, explaining what their role is, or not doing a good job of explaining that. But yeah, so I mean, all to say, I don't think that there's any, I don't see any kind of evidence or indication that there's kind of a major new shift in terms of the financing of groups like ISWAP going on, right? What I see is that, West Africa as a whole is in a pretty tense political space. I mean, I was alluding earlier, or mentioning earlier, the ties between Nigeria and Niger. I mean, right, the Nigerian junta leader had just previously accused Nigeria of harboring terrorists against Niger, which, again, I don't think is happening, but it shows that level of mistrust across the region. So in that kind of climate, I think you often get these statements, from officials that kind of, that are, again, quite vague. They're not necessarily making allegations directly, but it's kind of, and it's also a way of explaining, why is this problem persistent, right? Because no one wants to say, oh well, we've not been able to handle the situation. And I mean, there's truth to it insofar as, like, Boko Haram, the insurgents do take advantage of the porous boundaries and stuff. They move back and forth. You know, a lot of the logistics that they get in Lake Chad go through Niger and stuff. So, there is an international dimension to all of this, but I don't think it's kind of needs to be coded in this kind of language of nefarious conspiracy or stuff. But again, I mean, there's a reason why people believe that and why they propagate those messages, because there is a long history of intervention and, conspiracy and stuff in this part of the world. I mean, I did my master's degree on ECOMOG, and you talk to retired ECOMOG soldiers who were there, and, it's, who sold out Samuel Doe, all that stuff.
Yeah.
Like, there's always intrigue, right? It's politics.
It's amazing. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. But James, like Riley said, there's definitely has to be a part 2 of this. We could talk about. There's going to be a part 2 of this conversation. But yeah, this is an amazing conversation. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. I know there are still aspects that we didn't cover, but definitely there'll be a part 2. Have cover maybe when you've done more research and some of the things. But yeah, really appreciate you for the for coming again and hopefully you work your magic on our numbers. And yeah, but congrats once again for your stuff, and thank you very much for your rich and insightful comments. Thank you very much, James.
Oh, thanks so much, Michael, for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, all the best. Take care for now.
Cheers.
Thank you once again for another very interesting episode, and have me join me in thanking our guest, our returning guest, James Barnett, for his very, very rich and insightful expose or insight into the Boko Haram's insurgency in Nigeria, its connections, and its international sources of funding. Stay blessed, and I'll see you again next week. All the best.